Climate law matters, ecosystem collapse, and the UK's national security. Hello, listener, and welcome back to our first Climate Law Matters podcast of 2026. Apologies on behalf of the team that we haven't been here to distract you during the cold winter months of January and February, but we are now back with an interesting lineup of guests to discuss key developments in the climate change sphere. I'm Flora Curtis, a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers specialising in environmental and climate change law, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Ruth Chambers. Ruth will likely be well known to most of our listeners. She's a senior fellow at Green Alliance, an independent think tank which focuses on ambitious leadership for the environment, accelerating political action, and creating transformative policy for a green, equitable and prosperous UK. Ruth also wears many other hats, including as an honorary professor of practice at the UCL Centre for Law and the Environment, advisor to River Action UK and the RSPB, and chair of the charity Food Rise, formerly known as Global Feedback, I believe, which will be going to the Supreme Court later this year in an important appeal concerning the Aarhus Convention and access to justice in environmental claims. Ruth is a returning guest who's here today to talk to me about the government's National Security Assessment of Global Biodiversity Loss and Ecosystem Collapse. So Ruth, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, and what a great topic to kick off the new series.
Definitely. So just for a bit of background about this report, so it's a National Security Assessment of Biodiversity Loss and Ecosystem Collapse. I imagine that many environmental practitioners won't necessarily be familiar with national security assessments, but in your understanding, what actually is a national security assessment?
Well, it's a great question because I don't think that we've seen one quite like this before. And I've gone into the assessment to really check what it says its aim is. And its aim is to support UK national security planning by identifying risks to the UK from global biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. And it tries to answer three really important questions. One, what are the most significant implications of global biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse for UK national security? Two, which ecosystems are more critical for UK national security? And three, what would be the impact on UK national security from the collapse of individual critical ecosystems?
And before this document was published, how did you and Green Alliance become aware of the existence of a specific national security assessment on this topic? And how did you go about trying to get access to it?
Well, we'd heard it was being prepared and it was expected in the autumn of 2025. And we were excited about the publication because it was definitely a missing document in the various kind of government reports that exist. But then it didn't appear. And the Times journalist Adam Vaughan wrote a piece on 8th of October suggesting that Number 10 had blocked its publication. So as this assessment is clearly in the public interest, I asked for it to be published via a Freedom of Information request. That was initially refused, as many often are, so I appealed that decision via a process called internal review. The deadline for that internal review was the 20th of January, earlier this year, and on that day, the government published the assessment that we're talking about today. So what I think happened in this case is that the FOI acted as a useful lever for those people working in government and pressing for transparency to win the argument on this occasion.
Yeah, so a really important example of that transparency regime actually working as it should do. But the document itself it's a relatively short document. I think it's about 10 pages before you get to the annexes, which is perhaps quite surprising for an assessment of such a massive topic. As far as you know, is the report that's actually been put into the public domain the full version of the report, or is there potentially further detail that the public hasn't seen yet?
So I think there's further detail for two reasons. One is what you've just said. This feels, even though there is lots of useful information in it, quite short for such an important and strategic assessment of so many critical issues. But secondly, there was a report last week on ITV News where journalists there claimed to have seen the full report, which contained more information. For example, one of the statistics that they mentioned that isn't in this summary report is that the potential amount of carbon that would be released from collapse of the Amazon rainforest could be equivalent to between 50 and 20 years of global CO2 emissions. So I think that there's more. Whether or not or when the government will publish it remains to be seen. And Green Alliance, along with a number of other environmental NGOs, has asked the government to publish this full report without delay.
So there could be more to come down the line then. So looking then at the report itself, I mean, the assessment, as we've discussed, it focuses on biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. What does ecosystem collapse actually mean for the purposes of the assessment? And what does it identify as some of the key drivers of potential ecosystem collapse?
Well, to kick off, maybe it's worth just looking at what the key ecosystems are that the report identifies as being critical for UK national security because of the likelihood and the impact of their potential collapse. So the 6 are the Amazon rainforest, the Congo Basin, coral reefs, mangroves, Himalayas, and then boreal forests in Russia and in Canada. Your next question is about what's an ecosystem collapse. So my understanding is that an ecosystem collapses when it passes beyond a critical threshold or tipping point, after which time it can no longer maintain those essential functions or structures, and that can lead to extensive shifts in its size and composition, and the ecosystem would transition irreversibly from one stable state to another. So to give you an example, were the Amazon basin to collapse, then that could see it shift to a drier savanna state, for example. And then in terms of the key drivers, the assessment splits these into 2 categories. The first is what it calls direct drivers, so things like climate change, land and sea use change, pollution and invasive species and over-exploitation. And then there's a whole host of what's called indirect drivers, so things like population growth, consumption, poverty, migration and conflict, and more things as well.
When does the government's assessment envisage that critical ecosystems to the UK are going to begin collapsing? Because I think often in the climate change sphere, we're used to talking about the end of the century, which can sometimes feel like quite a long time away. But are there sooner timescales that are set out in the report for when things are going to get pretty bad?
There are sooner timescales, and they are quite scary, and they should really help focus minds. But I think the first thing to say is that the assessment does note there's a high degree of uncertainty around the timing and the pathways around which different ecosystems might collapse. But it also says, and this is really quite a daunting thought, that there's a realistic possibility that we may already have knowingly crossed some thresholds, and that irreversible collapse of some ecosystems is inevitable. For example, on coral reefs, though we may not see the impacts of that for several years. To get on to specific timing, the assessment notes there's a realistic possibility that some ecosystems start to collapse by 2030 or sooner as a result of biodiversity loss from land use change, pollution, climate change, and other drivers. And it also says there's a realistic possibility that coral reefs in Southeast Asia and boreal forests will start to collapse from 2030 and rainforests and mangroves from 2050. So while there is uncertainty on the exact timescales, none of those dates are very far into the future, which should really focus the minds of government and lead to action now rather than at a later date.
And in terms of the potential security risks to the UK posed by the collapse of these key ecosystems, what kind of risks are we talking about?
So it's things like the displacement of millions of people, changes to global weather patterns, increased global food and water scarcity, and greater geopolitical competition for resources. All of these things will affect how our society operates, the things that we've come to take for granted, and really should cause us to think very differently about how we manage and plan our actions as a society and a government.
I think it's particularly timely to be reading about, potential interactions with geopolitical instability, given the week that we're currently having across the world. But I mean, in terms of those risks and in terms of the timescales identified in the report, is there anything positive, I suppose, that it says in terms of what we could do to mitigate those risks, or suggestions of things that governments can do and things that we can focus our minds on to try and mitigate the risk of biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse?
So there's not very much at all in the assessment about action, but in a way, I guess that's not surprising, as this is an assessment rather than an action plan. Maybe there's more about how those risks could be mitigated or the action that would need to be taken in the full report. Let's see if and when that's ever published. But publishing it would be a good next step to allow Parliament, civil society and the media the chance to scrutinise what the government is intending to do to address the risks that the assessment identifies. But what is really clear from the timescales that the assessment sets out is that action is needed and should be taken urgently and not put off.
So I think in terms then of the impact of this report, I think it can be easy sometimes when you work in the environmental and climate sphere to become a bit desensitized to reports like this, which warn about the potentially devastating impacts of the climate and biodiversity crises, because I feel like we end up reading about them quite often from things like IPCC reports. But were you particularly surprised by any of the findings set out in the assessment? And was there anything that really stuck in your mind from reading through it?
I wasn't surprised, perhaps for the reasons that you say. I think, you can become numb in a way to these sorts of assessments and impacts. But I was definitely alarmed and worried. But what about you, Flora? Did anything in the report stand out to you or strike you with a particular chord of horror?
I suppose it's perhaps surprising to see it set out so starkly in a document produced by the government itself and put out into the public domain, but not necessarily surprised by the content, so to speak. I think then, what's the impact been of the publication of this assessment so far as you're aware, and how do you expect that it could be used by campaigners and others going forwards to help to drive change in this area?
I guess the first thing to say is I was surprised when it was published because, as you said earlier, freedom of information requests are a really important tool to try and encourage and secure transparency. But quite often they don't work, or they end up in a dead end, or you get a little bit of what you asked for, but you've got to kind of go quite a long way to sort of do that. So I wasn't expecting the report to be published on that day when the internal review sort of expired. So that week was a bit of a whirlwind, to be honest, because it generated such interest, quite rightly, because of what it said. And because, again, it was published I think it was quite a busy news week, so people weren't expecting it. And that huge interest in the assessment has come from places that we don't normally get interest from. So, for example, Australian political journalists, where the Albanese government is sitting on a very similar equivalent national security assessment there. It's been written up by many journalists, which is great to see, and it's a story that, quite rightly and thankfully, doesn't seem to want to disappear. So long may that continue. And I guess the fact that this freedom of information request helped to unlock its publication, that's something that has also caught a bit of imagination and has been part of the story. But of course, the real story is what this assessment says and what the government is going to do about it.
And it's certainly positive that it has managed to pick up that attention, because I think I'm right in saying that it was published almost under the radar a bit, in the sense that there wasn't an announcement that it was going to be coming. It sort of just appeared on the government website without much fanfare.
I need to go and look for it because the government said, sorry, we're not going to allow your internal review because we've actually published it and here's the link. So we then shared that link around. I think perhaps some journalists that had been covering that story were then quite quick to react as well. But unless government, when it publishes reports, does that legwork, does the press release, lines up some media briefs and that sort of thing, they can often sink without a trace. But in this case, that didn't happen because it was a report and an assessment that people had really been waiting for. So I think because of that interest, because of some of that early media coverage, because of podcasts like this and interest in the legal community, this was a report that was never going to disappear into the ether in a very kind of silent way, thank goodness. But yes, of course, more could be done to have advertised it. But again, I go back to that point that we've been discussing. What matters now is what the government's going to do with it and what action it's going to take and how it can tell us as concerned citizens, civil society, parliamentarians and the media what that action is and when it will be forthcoming.
And just as a final question then, which we asked all our guests, so apologies because I believe you will have answered this already when you were last on the podcast, but I'll ask you again anyway in case the answer has changed. But generally, what do you see as the greatest legal barrier to addressing climate change, or more positively, the most important legal development in the climate change sphere that has had a positive impact?
Well, I wonder what my answer was last time. I can't remember. It'll be interesting to go back and check. But I think given the times that we're in, for me, the greatest barrier to addressing climate change in the legal sphere is the attacks on the law itself rather than what the law says. That's what worries me the most. And it's clear from this assessment that determined action is needed across government and the political spectrum to tackle the serious and systemic risks that have been identified. Now is the time for political unity, not discord.
Ruth, thank you so much for your time. It's been great to have you back on our podcast today, and hopefully you'll be back again at some point in the future, maybe when the full assessment is published.
Thanks so much for having me.